Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that you might not think about all that often, deworming.
Yeah.
And, most people think about deworming their pets, or maybe something they need to worry about if they travel abroad. But it turns out that's not always the case.
Right.
So we've got some really interesting source material to dive into today.
Yeah, it should be a good one.
We've got a recent article from the CDC on parasitic infections in the U.S.
Okay.
We've got a study on the link between deworming and cognitive function in children,
Interesting.
and even some personal anecdotes from people who have experienced the unexpected benefits of deworming firsthand.
That sounds like we've got a lot to cover.
Yeah, we're going to uncover some surprising facts and maybe debunk a few myths along the way.
Looking forward to it.
So to kick things off, why don't we start by talking about why deworming is so important in many parts of the world?
Okay, so deworming, often gets kind of put in that category of developing world problems. But it turns out that parasitic infections are a lot more widespread than a lot of people realize.
Yeah, I guess you don't really think about it too much living here in the U.S.
Right.
So why is that? I mean, why is deworming so crucial in those other parts of the world?
Well, it really comes down to the fact that there's just so many parasitic infections in areas that maybe don't have the best access to clean water or sanitation.
Makes sense.
So we're talking about things like hookworms, roundworms, tapeworms, those kinds of intestinal worms that can cause a whole bunch of different problems.
Okay, so more than just a stomachache.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Things like malnutrition, anemia, stunted growth, even a weakened immune system. So it's a really big public health challenge.
Wow, so it sounds like it's not just about, you know, feeling a little bit under the weather. These infections can actually have some pretty serious long-term consequences.
Absolutely. And just to give you an idea of how serious these things can be, did you know that hookworms can actually latch onto the intestinal wall and cause chronic blood loss?
Oh, wow.
And that leads to iron deficiency anemia, which of course can impact energy levels, development, and, just overall well-being, especially for kids.
Yeah, that's a pretty vivid image. I don't think I'm going to be forgetting that anytime soon.
Yeah, it's not pretty.
So we've talked about some of the more immediate problems caused by these parasitic infections, but I've also heard that deworming can actually have some benefits that go beyond just addressing those immediate issues.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So what are some of those kind of unexpected benefits?
Well, one of the areas that researchers are really interested in is the connection between deworming and cognitive function.
Okay.
And some studies have actually shown that when kids are dewormed, their cognitive performance can actually improve.
Really?
Yeah, so it seems like when you have these infections, they kind of divert resources away from the brain's development.
Makes
But when those infections are cleared up, then all of a sudden, those resources can be redirected back to where they need to be.
So you're saying it's not just about physical health. These parasites can actually affect how kids learn and develop.
Exactly.
Wow, that's huge. What about adults, though? Are there any surprising benefits for us grown-ups?
Yeah, there's more and more evidence that suggests that deworming might be linked to better nutrient absorption.
Okay.
And the thinking is that when these parasites are hanging out in your gut, they're basically competing with you for all those nutrients.
Also, even if you are eating a healthy diet, you might not be getting all the good stuff.
Right. And that, of course, can lead to deficiencies even if you think you're doing everything right. But when you deworm, it allows your body to actually absorb those nutrients more effectively, which can really have a positive impact on your overall health.
Huh. So even if you don't have any, obvious symptoms, those little parasites could be quietly stealing your nutrients.
It's possible.
That's something to think about.
Yeah, it's definitely something to consider, especially if you've traveled to an area where those infections are more common or if you have any other risk factors.
Now, I know this is going to sound like a silly question, but I've always heard that deworming isn't really something we need to worry about here in developed countries like the U.S.
Mhm.
Is there any truth to that?
Well, it is true that the number of parasitic infections is lower here in the U.S.,
Okay.
but that doesn't mean they don't exist at all.
Oh, okay.
There are definitely still some pockets where these infections are more common, especially within certain groups of people.
So who should be thinking about deworming even if they live in a developed country?
Well, we're talking about immigrants who might have come from areas where it's more common.
Okay.
Travelers returning from places where these infections are endemic. And by the way, endemic just means a region where a particular disease is regularly found.
Got it.
And also people who live in rural areas where they're more likely to come into contact with livestock.
Makes sense.
And of course, Anyone who has any kind of unexplained symptoms that could be linked to a parasitic infection should definitely talk to their doctor about it.
So it's not just about geography. It's about your individual circumstances and risk factors.
Exactly.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But if these infections do exist in the U.S., why isn't routine deworming just standard practice here?
That's a great question. There are a few reasons for that.
Okay.
So, first of all, as we mentioned, the overall prevalence is lower in the US.
Right.
So, the healthcare system here tends to focus more on targeted treatment rather than these big mass deworming campaigns that you might see in other parts of the world.
I see.
And then there's also the concern about drug resistance if deworming medications are overused.
Okay. So it's kind of like with antibiotics.
Right, exactly.
You don't want to be taking them all the time if you don't need them.
Exactly. And then lastly, here in the US, there's a really big emphasis on getting a diagnosis through testing before starting any kind of treatment.
Okay. So it's a more nuanced approach here based on individual needs and, weighing the potential risks and benefits.
Exactly. And that's why it's always so important to talk to your doctor if you have any concerns at all.
Right. They can help you figure out your specific situation, order any texts that might be needed, and, ultimately recommend the best course of action for you.
Exactly.
So that brings up another interesting point. What are some situations where a doctor might actually recommend deworming for someone here in the U.S.?
Well, aside from those groups that we already talked about, like immigrants and travelers and people in rural areas, there are a few other times when a doctor might recommend deworming.
Okay.
So let's say you've traveled to a place where those kinds of infections are more common,
Okay.
and now you're having some digestive issues, maybe you've got an upset stomach or something.
Yeah.
That's definitely something to bring up with your doctor because it could be a sign of a parasitic infection.
So even if you don't think it's anything serious, it's worth mentioning.
Right, exactly. And same thing if you have anemia, especially iron deficiency anemia, that could also be a sign of something going on.
Okay.
And then any other kind of unusual symptoms like skin lesions or digestive problems that just haven't gone away with other treatments, those should also be checked out.
So it's really about, being aware of the possibility and talking to your doctor if you have any red flags.
Absolutely. It's not about self-diagnosing or anything like that,
Right.
but it's about being proactive about your health and, just being informed.
Yeah. Speaking of that, I was reading this story about a woman who had been struggling with digestive problems for years.
Mm,
Like she had tried everything, diet changes, probiotics, all that stuff, but nothing seemed to work.
wow.
And then finally she went on a trip to Southeast Asia.
Okay.
And when she got back, she was still having problems. So she went to the doctor,
Yeah.
and the doctor suggested a stool test. And it turned out she had a parasitic infection.
Oh, wow.
And once she took the deworming medication, all her symptoms completely disappeared.
That's amazing.
Yeah, so it really just shows you that sometimes, even in developed countries, these things can happen, and we might not even realize it.
Right. Sometimes the simplest solution is the one that we overlook.
Exactly. And it just highlights how important it is to, talk to our doctors and not just brush off those symptoms that seem unrelated.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of treatment, let's talk about the medications that are used for deworming.
Okay.
So the most common ones are albendazole and mebendazole.
Okay.
And basically, those medications work by messing with the parasite's metabolism.
Okay.
So they basically prevent those worms from absorbing nutrients, and then eventually they starve and get eliminated from the body.
So it's a very targeted attack on the parasite's ability to survive.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there are different types of parasites.
Right.
So does the type of medication vary depending on which parasite you have?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So, for example, if somebody has a tapeworm infection, they're usually going to get a medication called praziquantel.
Okay.
And then there's another parasite called Strongyloids stercoralis.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, I know, right? And that one can be particularly stubborn, so they usually treat it with ivermectin.
Interesting. So it's fascinating how specific these treatments can be. But you also mentioned earlier that there's a concern about drug resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that play into all of this?
Yeah, drug resistance is a big concern.
Yeah.
And it's not just with deworming medications either, it's with antibiotics too.
Right.
And the problem is that if we overuse these medications or use them when we don't really need them,
Right.
it can lead to these resistant strains that are basically, superbugs that aren't affected by the medications anymore.
Yeah, that's not good.
So it's really important to use these medications responsibly and only when they're absolutely necessary.
So, following your doctor's guidance is super important in those cases.
Exactly. They're the ones who can figure out the right medication and dosage for your specific situation.
Makes sense.
And of course, preventing those infections in the first place is always the best strategy.
Right, like those good hygiene habits that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. Things like washing your hands and handling food safely, those can go a long way in reducing the overall need for these medications.
Yeah, it all comes back to those basic healthy habits.
Yeah.
Now, are there any side effects that people should be aware of when it comes to these deworming medications?
Well, most people handle deworming medications really well.
Okay, good.
And the side effects, if there are any, are usually pretty mild and don't last very long.
Right.
So some people might have an upset stomach, maybe some dizziness, headache, or itching, but those usually go away pretty quickly.
That's good to know.
Mhm.
So what about the schedule for deworming? Is there like a standard recommendation or does it vary?
Yeah, it definitely varies. It really depends on a lot of things, like your individual risk factors,
Right.
your travel history, whether you have any symptoms, those kinds of things.
Okay.
So, for instance, kids who live in areas where these infections are really common might need to be dewormed every 6 months.
Well,
But then adults who haven't been exposed to those areas might only need it every 1 or 2 years.
so it's really a personalized approach based on your individual circumstances.
Exactly. And again, that's where talking to your healthcare provider is so important.
Right. They can help figure out what makes sense for you.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the global impact of these parasitic infections.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about the surprising benefits of deworming,
Yeah.
and we've debunked that myth that it's not something we need to worry about in developed countries.
Right.
And we've even talked about some practical considerations for people who might be at risk.
And I think we learned that, even though those parasitic infections aren't as common in places like the US, it's still important to, be aware of the possibility
Yeah.
and to have those conversations with our healthcare providers if we have any concerns.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about preventative measures.
Okay.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What are some practical things that people can do to lower their risk of getting these infections in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to preventing these parasitic infections, a lot of the things are, pretty basic stuff that we've all heard before.
Right.
But it's worth repeating because, they really do work.
Okay. So what are your top tips for keeping those parasites away?
Well, the most important thing is good hygiene.
Okay.
Washing your hands, really thoroughly with soap and water, especially after using the restroom and before you eat or prepare food.
Yeah.
That's a really simple way to cut down on transmission.
It does sound simple, but it's amazing how often we forget or, just kind of rush through it.
It's easy to get lazy. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So what else besides hand washing?
Another really important thing is just being careful about how you handle food.
Okay.
So make sure you cook meat all the way through to kill any parasites that might be in there.
Right.
Wash your fruits and veggies really well, especially if you're eating them raw.
Yeah.
And be careful about the water you drink.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
Stick to sources that, are safe, or use a water purifier if you're not sure.
So basically just being mindful of what we're putting into our bodies.
Exactly. And, if you're traveling to an area where these infections are more common, it's really important to take some extra precautions.
Okay, like what?
Well, you might want to avoid street food,
Okay.
stick to bottled water,
Yeah.
and, you could even talk to your doctor about taking a preventative course of deworming medication before you go.
So travel medicine's a whole other thing.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, maybe we need to do a deep dive on that sometime.
That would be interesting.
But for now, I think the main takeaway is just to be informed and proactive about protecting your health.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's empowering to know that we actually have some control over these things.
For sure.
So as we wrap up our deep dive on deworming, what are the most important things you want our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that deworming isn't just a problem for developing countries. It's
Mhm.
something that we all need to be aware of no matter where we live.
Right.
Parasitic infections can happen to anyone, and it's really important to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms.
And we've learned that deworming can have some pretty surprising benefits, too.
Yeah.
It's not just about getting rid of the immediate problems caused by those infections.
Right. It can actually help with things like cognitive function and nutrient absorption.
Right, and maybe even help with some digestive issues.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something to think about, even if you don't think you have any symptoms.
And if you do have any concerns, don't be afraid to talk to your doctor.
Yeah, they can help you figure out if you're at risk and what you should do.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation.
It has
We've
been.
learned so much about deworming and how it can impact our health.
For sure.
But, with any deep dive, there's always more to explore.
That's the best part about knowledge. It's always a journey.
So, to our listeners, we encourage you to keep learning and asking questions.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to dig a little deeper into the things that interest you.
You never know what you might find.
Exactly. And on that note, we want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of deworming.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope you found it informative and engaging and maybe even a little bit life-changing.
Until next time.
Stay curious and keep exploring.